Hi, and welcome to a presentation on my proposed leadership initiative for the next church year. This is your ministerial intern, Chris, and the initiative is called Showing Hospitality to Strangers, Entertaining Angels Among Us. So as most of you already know, this initiative focuses in on both expanding and deepening our participation in immigration during a year which immigration reform may happen at the national level, and offering that work with immigration to help to begin to develop ties with the folks in the neighborhood surrounding our church. So why choose this? Well, we're in that highly diverse neighborhood that has a large Latino population. Immigration is important to and often touches the lives of many of our neighbors, even those who are not recent immigrants themselves. It leverages an existing interest in immigration in our congregation with my background and connections with nonprofit groups working in the field. And it begins to forge multicultural relationships and engagement. So I want to give you a brief overview of the major components of the initiative across the life of the church, but I first want to say that in further conversations with some of you all, with Kate and other leaders in the church, we felt it was important to really keep the scope in mind because the church has so much else going on during this transition period. And so I focused in on two types of major components. The first type is, for instance, doing religious education across all ages on immigration or welcoming the stranger, but doing so when religious education classes would have already been happening and we're just focusing in on this area. So we're not adding a lot of work for our staff or lay leaders by doing that sort of thing. The other type of major component are new initiatives. But for those, I've tried to focus in on new initiatives where there's already a lot of lay enthusiasm and a lot of willingness to assume leadership for those. So here briefly are the major components. We'll do at least 2 worship services. Both will have significant lay leadership. Looking at expanding our existing Dream Sabbath. Talk more about that in a bit. Having fellowship and connections after these services. Starting a detention center visitation program. We'll go out to the T. Don Hutto Immigration Detention Center. That's in Taylor, Texas, about 35 or 40 minutes away. It houses all women immigrants, up to about 512 people at any given time. We'll be collecting items such as toiletry, office supplies, particularly paper, clothing, for the Center for Survivors of Torture and their clients. That's a nonprofit that I'll tell you more about in just a little bit. Doing religious education across all age groups, which I mentioned. Offering English as a second language courses, either in cooperation with some work that Faith Presbyterian is already doing and or working with Center for Survivors of Torture, which offer those classes also and can help us learn to do so. But also within the church, offering Spanish as a second language classes for beginning Spanish speaker people just learning to speak Spanish, as well as Spanish language cafes, hopefully one at an intermediate level and one at an advanced level. These are for folks that already speak Spanish or are coming out of that beginning Spanish class to get together once a month over coffee or lunch, speak only in Spanish so they can practice, perhaps read a Spanish language book together. And then finally, immigration reform updates with fellowship to go with that. We would do one in the fall, one in the spring. We'd use that interpretation equipment so we could offer them in both English and Spanish and invite our neighborhood in again. And depending on what's going on, obviously, they would be about what's coming up with immigration reform, or what now if it's passed, or what now if it fails. All right, one of the key concepts for this initiative, both for my school and for the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, is this idea of crossing borders, meaning are we working more with folks that we perhaps haven't worked with as much in the past? Are we doing multi-ethnic, multiracial, anti-oppression, anti-racial work? And are we challenging ourselves? Are we crossing a border by going further than our comfort zone may have been before? And I think that this initiative approaches that in several ways. The first, especially as regards immigration, we're looking at it in a much broader way, and we're doing some things that are more complicated and perhaps more difficult. For instance, when we visit the women in the detention center, many of them will be survivors of torture or other trauma, or they may be women who committed a crime, served their time for that, and now are being held in immigration detention while they wait to see what's going to happen with their immigration status. We'll be reaching out into our communities, out into our neighborhood, to those nonprofits I talked about. But also, we'll be inviting people in to come into our church for connection fairs, for those immigration reform updates, for the English as a second language courses. As I talked about, offering classes so that we're breaking down language barriers. And forging new relationships, again in our community and with some of these nonprofit groups. Tell you about those now. Wow, that was fancy. Grassroots Leadership is a nonprofit that actually works on the larger issue of the criminal justice and for-profit detention center complex that some of us have been reading about in the book called The New Jim Crow, that's so oppressive to particularly African American and Latino men. They'll be doing our training on how to do the detention center visits. That's fancy too. Center for Survivors of Torture, or CST. They provide psychiatric and psychological counseling for people that have experienced torture or other trauma, primarily asylum seekers and refugees. They also provide a number of other social services for their clients. And then American Gateways. They provide immigration legal services, they advocate on behalf of immigration reform, and they help people connect with other types of services for immigrants. They maintain expertise on immigration law and potential immigration reform, and will be doing those updates for us. So, one of the things that I've included on page 8 of your handout is that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis, or SWOT analysis, that you may remember that we did church as a whole a while back. I've included church as a whole because I think that affects this initiative, but I've added in italices some things that have come up specific to the initiative, and I want to talk about a few of those now. First, in terms of strengths and opportunities, one of the things that I've experienced is really broad support across various groups and people in the congregation, at least in general, on the topic of immigration. I've also seen some support from folks who haven't been as engaged, at least not as engaged in our social justice and interfaith activities in the past, although they may have been involved in the life of the church in other ways, but they seem really excited about this particular initiative. In terms of this ministerial internship committee, of the various ideas that I brought you a while back on what might become a focus initiative, this topic was the one for which there seemed to be the most enthusiasm. And then we seem to have a lot of lay folks that are already saying they'll step up and take on some leadership responsibility for the various components of the initiative. Now, we did hear some alternative perspectives. We're Unitarian Universalists after all, as well as some challenges that I think may come up. One of the things that I heard a couple of times right after I did the sermon on immigration detention is this idea of why concentrate on the undocumented when we have so many current citizens that are suffering and experiencing oppression. In one of the groups I think that Jan spoke with, one of the members really wanted us, when we're doing education, to present a balanced perspective on immigration. They talked about how useful it was to hear from a church member that runs a contracting business and tries to pay fair wages, and yet their competitors are hiring undocumented folks and paying them much lower wages. The congregation is dealing with a lot right now, and they may be in a settled minister search at the same time that we're doing all of this, so working to avoid overwhelming our leadership. And then while it can be exciting and motivating that the public policy debate and maybe action on the national level on immigration could occur during this time period, that can also lead to changes in what the needs are and what the environment in which we're doing this in are. And so we'll have to be flexible and nimble as that plays out. So here are some hunches why I think we can be successful with this despite some of those challenges. Again, that considerable enthusiasm around immigration and developing deeper ties with our neighborhood. And I talked about we focus a lot on activities that can be done in the existing infrastructure, or if it's a new activity, it already has some significant lay support. Tried to provide a wide array and ways and levels of participating, so people can do anything from the detention visits to writing a couple of letters to their congresspeople in support of immigration reform, or bringing items for the collections for CST. It's a resilient and adaptive congregation. I think it's proven itself that, and that will be very helpful as we see how immigration reform plays out. And then we have loving, open-minded folks, and they have a desire to grow and to learn. So even when it comes to some of those alternative perspectives, I think there's a great opportunity there for us all to get a broader structural view of how what's going on with the criminal justice system and imprisoning people overall is really the larger structure within which what's going on with immigration detention is occurring. So I gave you a timeline that's more detailed on pages 9 to 10 of the handout. I'm going to go through this very quickly here. August is when I'll be stepping back in, reconfirming lay commitments, making sure that these activities are on the worship schedule or on the RE schedules. Begin planning a first worship service, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And each month then I'll be working on communicating what's going to happen in the next month's events, both within the church as well as in our neighborhood in English and in Spanish. I'll note that a lot of this stuff as far as getting on calendars will actually be occurring sooner than August, but at least by August. September, that first worship service, we are hoping that one of the women that has been released from the detention center will be able to come and talk with us. We don't know that for sure yet. If not, we know we have some stories of people that have been affected by the detention center that can be shared. We'll have some of the people on the core lay team that want to do the detention visits present those as homilies for us. And then people will be able to meet the folks from grassroots and sign up to get trained to go do those detention center visits right after the service. And that training will occur then later in the month. We will launch the first English as a Second Language class, and we'll start promoting the immigration reform update both in the church and in our neighborhood. In October, we'll begin Adult RE on immigration. We'll have the immigration reform update with dinner and discussion. We may begin the detention center visits, although it may realistically take till November to get that fully set up. And we'll begin religious education for grades 7 through 12. And a question I have here for folks to think about: should we delay the immigration reform update because of the stewardship campaign in October, or can we use it as one way to help promote the campaign? In November, we'll do some pre-K religious education classes. We'll start the Spanish as Second Language classes, and we'll start assessing our progress and challenges so far. December, we'll do the first intergenerational collection for CST. Do that early in the month, probably focusing on sort of the gift-giving theme for the holidays. I'll be again working with the Dream Sabbath core team to plan that service probably for February, because I'll be out of town for classes for part of January, and then the Spanish classes will continue. January, I might see some of that snow in Chicago. I'm not sure we'll see it here. We'll complete the planning of the Dream Sabbath and really start promoting it in the church, in our neighborhood, in the media, and through our interfaith partners. And that's really where we'd like to expand it, is to get more folks involved. And then we'll start those Spanish language cafes that I mentioned. So in February, we'll hold the Dream Sabbath with fellowship event afterwards. We'll do RE for people in grades 1 through 3, and we'll begin a new set of the English as Second Language classes. There's the blue bonnets that signal spring and March and April. We'll hold our second immigration update there. Obviously, something may have happened by then, so we may be talking what the consequences of whatever happened will be. We'll begin planning an April worship service, which I hope will be some of the lay folks that do the detention center visits talking about their experiences. April, we'll do the RE for grades 4 through 6. We'll do the worship service I just talked about, and we'll follow that with a collection for Center for Survivors of Torture right afterwards. May will be in candidating month, possibly, and I'll also be in sort of the review and assessment process for wrapping up the internship. So I didn't plan a lot of activities in May. I will be working to encourage lay leadership to continue, especially those new projects we've started, as well as making sure they're connected with the nonprofits so those relationships can continue. There are a couple of things we want to do that I can't really put on a calendar yet. Jodine of the worship team is submitting both Grassroots Leadership and CST to be recipients of our second offerings, but that schedule has not been laid out yet. And we will continue our work with Austin Interfaith, some of which has been immigration related, and I'll need to make sure that we monitor and coordinate that with the stuff we're doing specifically within the church. So what's all this going to cost us? Well, I'm hoping in terms of money, not much at all. If we can get folks to help us by doing potluck meals for the various fellowship activities, it shouldn't cost anything more than volunteer time. If we have to pay for some of them or buy the food and bring it in, I'm estimating that we can do that for around $300. The faith classes for English as a second language actually charge $200 for the materials and 8 weeks worth of training. Some of the folks that we might invite in may not be able to afford that. We could look at some scholarship funds through our existing social justice funds, or we could look at providing free classes through Center for Survivors of Torture. Obviously, we'll have lots of needs for space use. Volunteer and leadership time will be needed. A percentage of my time will be required. And in my experience with going to detention centers in the past, sometimes pastoral care needs come up. People that we visit sometimes have some really horrible situations that they've been through, and there can be kind of a secondary trauma effect. And Center for Survivors of Torture can also help in those kinds of situations if we need them to. So what happens after the internship? How do we keep all this going? Well, we're trying to establish core lay teams for the new activities that will keep those going. The Spanish language courses and the cafe curricula and structure will be laid out. It should be easy to continue or expand those. Same thing, we'll have the relationships for the ESL classes, and congregants whose Spanish has gotten stronger might want to learn to teach some of those classes. The idea of bringing in a guest presentation and having dinner and discussion, inviting the neighborhood, that format could be replicated, as well as the idea of taking some topic and doing it church-wide, like we're doing with immigration, with worship, religious education, interfaith activities, social justice activities, and fellowship. That could be replicated with other topics. And then we may have the possibility that some of these people that we're inviting in will have a new interest in getting involved in the life of the church. Particularly the staff at CST have told us that some of their clients are people who actually were harmed by their religion, so they're looking for a new way to have spirituality, and or they've come here and the religion that they came from, there's just not enough of it here to have an institution, so they're looking for a church. And so this may lead to some first steps in multiculturalism. So, briefly, some questions I'd love to discuss. The scale and flexibility of what I've proposed. Is it flexible enough? Is the scale right? Who else should I involve and speak with? And is the scheduling and timing, does it seem to be workable? And there is the flaming end. Thanks so much.